It is overwhelmingly positive, but similar to the near-death experience, 20% is hellish. The vast majority of near-death experiences are largely very positive. But again, that's not always the case.
Welcome. I'm here again with Dr. Bob Davis. Bob, good to see you again.
It's a pleasure to be with you again.
Okay, so I think we ended the last episode. We were talking about AI and consciousness and kind of modalities to think about or review. Let's kind of continue more along that path. What do you think AI sits in that mode?
Well, there's the debate about what consciousness is. If you consider it as information exchange, which is what I view consciousness as, just like this desk. A lot of people will say there's no consciousness associated with physical matter. But if I bang my head hard enough against it, the desk is informing me not to do it again. So is it conscious? Not like a human brain, but we are deriving information from it. Likewise, with AI, we're deriving a considerable amount of information from it. And the fear is, of course, is that it can develop its own consciousness, its own determination, and act on its own accordingly, bypassing, human interactions and human commands. And it depends on who programs it. It can be programmed for negative purposes as well as positive. And there's a whole spectrum of both positive as well as very negative aspects of AI that is going to alter society because it's a paradigm shift. And in my mind, we need a paradigm shift, not necessarily only with AI, but in terms of understanding this phenomenon, we need a paradigm shift on the order of the scientific revolution and quantum mechanics, because I think we are dealing with quantum mechanics here. But what is this phenomenon? And I do believe there is a quantum aspect to it in the form of consciousness coming out of this quantum foam or this holographic universe where people are indeed receiving information based on non-locality and quantum entanglement from intelligences far, far away. That's the only conclusion I can draw. You talk to Jacques Vallée, and he comes to the conclusion, if my memory serves me right, he says over the past 20 years, we have had 3 million individual UAP landings. 3 million. And how he comes up with that data, I don't know, but he's a computer scientist, and I guess he crunched the numbers, and that's what he came up with. Thinking again that it's a psychic phenomenon and it's a control system that's largely spiritual in nature. But look, throughout history, these entities have continually been here. They change their forms. They reflect, in a sense, the cultural context of the times. They were the elves, the gnomes, the fairies in the Middle Ages, the airships in the 19th century, the flying saucers in the 60s and 70s. They were flying triangles and flotillas in the early 2000s. Now we're seeing the orbs.
When the United States and China clash, the world will never be the same, especially when forces beyond reality threaten to intervene. What if the United States went to war with the People's Republic of China? How would these rivals fight for supremacy on land, sea, air, and across the stochastic streams of time? What wonder weapons would be unleashed? What horrors would emerge from the irradiated sludge of the South China Sea? What heroes would rise and forever change the course of history? Tread into the deepest and darkest dimensions of the multiverse, gaze through a kaleidoscope of fractured realities, and bear witness to the disturbing visions of World War III from today's greatest minds in science fiction, fantasy, and horror. Weird World War, China. Available now from Baen Books at Baen.com.
And for whatever reason, the phenomenon evolves to meet, for whatever reason, the status, the nature, the culture of the times. And we see evidence of this from cave walls to inside pyramids to the Bible and historical narratives where there's obvious evidence of interactions from extraterrestrials. The question is it extraterrestrial, interdimensional, or
cryptoterrestrials or ultra-terrestrials? Right.
Right. And it could be all of them.
Or it could be us in the future and all of them.
It could be us. There is a evolutionary biologist, and I forget his name, who contends that it is the future us.
Dr. Michael Masters.
Yeah. Michael Masters, yes, indeed. Thank you. Who coming back to collect genetic material because they're in need of it. And he will contend that these abductions, in part, occur to collect genetic material, and people who claim to be abducted physically and taken on board these craft, which seems to be conscious in and of itself, and these people claim that they can fly these craft using their own consciousness, and they claim to be given, hybrid babies. They claim to have these biological procedures performed to collect genetic material. Now, again, if this is indeed valid, then you can make it the possible case that the future is coming back to the present to collect genetic material for our own future needs, for the continuation successfully of the species. But they belong to a different dimension from ours. They appear illogical, and how can they not? It's a different form of consciousness. It's much faster kind of consciousness than ours, and they behave in such absurd ways. People who interact with creatures coming out of crafts, will say that this being was dressed in this funky looking outfit and comes up to me and says, "What time do you have?" Or asks some stupid, silly kind of question, and then abruptly turns around, walks back into the craft, and takes off. Or something absurd like that. Mm-hmm. But the point is that these absurd behaviors, like the Men in Black, after you interact with a UAP, the next day you'll get a knock on the door, and two men in black suits, looking a little strange, humanoid, will come greet you and tell you not to talk about your experience. What's that all about? So science ignores all of this. Again, it's all anecdotal. Is there a trickster element to this UAP, as many people contend? And it depends on the semantics of what you mean by a trickster. I don't think we're being put on in any meaningful way, but nor do I think it represents a demonic aspect of nature, as many people contend that this phenomenon represents. I will counter that by saying, if it's demonic, then why are these individuals coming up with these spiritual messages that are just beautiful in nature? To be more sensitive, caring, loving, don't worry about wealth, power, and fame, become less egoic, become less self-centered, become more loving. And these kind of positive messages is what people bring back from their interactions, by and large. So if it's demonic...
Excepting paranoid schizophrenics. If, you could say it's all mental, but maybe it's not. To advertise on Through a Glass Darkly, email throughaglassdarkly@gmail.com. Anyway, I didn't mean to... I'm more of a as above, so below kind of... You can't have good without evil. And I don't think... Do I believe it's exclusively demonic? Absolutely not. But I can see... there's a dark side to it too, right? But I think it's less visible and less apparent. And I think... based on the free study, as you mentioned, it's overwhelmingly positive.
It is overwhelmingly positive, but similar to the near-death experience, 20% is hellish. The vast majority of near-death experiences are largely very positive. But again, that's not always the case. Same thing with the Kundalini Awakenings. For those who are viewing this, who are not familiar with the Kundalini Awakening, I had one. It is real. I encourage your listeners to read about it.
Can you talk through
understand that it is real. It is a real phenomenon. And my socks were knocked off after I had one. But it came clear, and I don't want to go into great detail about it because it's getting off the topic, but it presented me with a dualistic aspect of understanding mind and body. I was experiencing absolute energetic bliss, love beyond description, yet my body was contorting like in Reagan in the movie The Exorcist, minus the pea soup. If you were observing me, I looked like I was suffering, crying mercifully, but at the same time, I'm feeling bliss and I'm observing my body while my head is deviating in an extreme position as possible. I couldn't control my body. I can go into more detail, but I'm not going to. But at the same time, my mind made the distinction. My body's doing this, but my mind is doing something completely different. So I had that duality kind of perspective, which people who have near-death experiences have. People who also interact with the UAP also have that kind of sense that they're not their body. They come away with a better understanding of themselves, the nature of themselves, and that they're not just a physical body. They become truth seekers, and any extraordinary experience, any awe-inspiring event out of the ordinary that is unexplainable, like a near-death experience, a Kundalini, precognition, ESP, mediumship, the whole range of these kinds of so-called paranormal phenomena. I don't like that term paranormal. They are real. They are real, and people experience them in varying ways, which brings to mind, getting back to the UAP, for instance, you talked about synchronicities earlier and the nature of this phenomenon. It reminds me of the physicist Massimo Teodoranti. Have you ever heard of Teodoranti? He studied the Hasdallen lights in Hasdallen, Norway, for about a decade. He was an astrophysicist. And he came away from his research with the conclusion that the phenomenon was trying to communicate with his subconscious mind and resulted in synchronistic behaviors. Anytime he wanted to take a picture of these orbs in Hasdallen, it wouldn't work. They caused malfunctions to his equipment, as if they had a mind of their own and were in control. Now, okay, that's interesting enough. But Harvey Rutledge, another astrophysicist, also did research on what we call them orbs, but they may be plasma ionized gases, the fourth state of matter. Harvey Rutledge also studied that phenomenon. I believe it was in either Kansas or Nebraska back in the 1980s. Teodoranti studied it in the 2000s. Harvey Rutledge came to that same conclusion. These strange lights also kind of synchronized with his mind with purposeful intent, as if they're actually trying to communicate with me. That's a conclusion he made. Yet he never talked to Teodoranti. They didn't know each other. Yet independently, decades apart, thousands of miles apart, came to the same conclusion. So
last September, in September 2024, there was a call for papers at Harvard about plasmoids, which, allegedly is exactly what you're talking about. These like sentient plasma. Okay. Can you still hear me?
I can hear you. Yeah.
What on earth is that? My camera just went out.
No, there could be a reason for that.
This is very strange.
Consistent with our conversation.
100%. Well, there was something else that happened right before this where my cell phone just turned itself off. And I just assumed that it just wasn't charging or something, but it was charging. And then it turned itself right back on. Again, just could be a technical glitch, something like that. But
well, electronic malfunctions are common, if you know what I mean.
Yep. Yep. I don't know what we said that would have triggered it now. Now it works.
There you go. Down the rabbit hole.
Wow. Okay. All right.
Okay.
All right. So for folks who just joined, we had some technical difficulties where my iPhone just shut off. And then shortly after that, my camera shut off on my Mac computer. And then my iPhone shut back on. Anyway, it's just very strange. You were talking about the Hessdalen lights. And we were talking about sentient plasmoids. That's what we were talking about.
Yes, plasma, the fourth state of matter. They're attracted, as you know, to electromagnetic activity. And there was a recent paper that just came out that emphasized how that they exist in the lower atmosphere and certainly do account for many UAP sightings over time. That they feed on that electromagnetic radiation, and they have different morphologies. That it can appear as a cloud, a donut, a sphere, a cylinder. They descend from the thermosphere into thunderstorms. They congregate by the hundreds, and they have interacted with satellites, generating electromagnetic activity. They even approach space shuttles. So NASA must have a wealth of information about these plasmoids. And it's easy to obviously confuse plasma phenomena with an extraterrestrial craft. We have to be very discriminating in how we analyze this. But they can behave in a very similar way to the phenomenology of a typical UAP in terms of their trajectory and the manner of its motion and behavior. They stop and start on a dime. So there are many similarities. In fact, the plasmas were photographed in the 1940s by the World War II pilots, called them Foo Fighters. I'm not sure if that was plasma or...
It certainly sounded like it the way it's described, right?
It could very well be. It did seem like balls of light as opposed to structured silvery discs. So we have to be careful, of course, in terms of how we interpret these things. When you talk to a pilot and a pilot says, yes, I saw a UAP, that doesn't necessarily mean it's extraterrestrial. It could have been plasma alone. We simply don't understand enough about it. And a paper just came out emphasizing how it can enter our atmosphere.
The Soviets also described them, too. They saw or interacted with, quote unquote, two types of life forms. So biological and then plasma.
Well, to many plasma physicists, plasma actually behaves like living cells. There are analogies that are being made between this electromagnetic or fourth state of matter, electromagnetic energy, when they combine, they're thought to have, believe it or not, an aspect of consciousness where they can interact with people. And just like the Hessdalen lights, where they had purposeful intent with Theodorani and Harvey Rutledge. Even in CE5s, people call down these orbs. They take pictures of it. When you try to process the photograph, you get anything but what you witnessed. They're in charge. Maybe plasma has a low level of consciousness, and I do believe that might very well be the case. But
or a higher level, or higher consciousness,
or a higher level. Yes, indeed. But it's easy to mistake it for a true, UAP. It is a UFO in a sense that it's not identifiable, but the answer could be plasma in nature. But it could be a pre-life form. That's the point. Or a more advanced form. And yeah, maybe the crypto terrestrial hypothesis is real. Maybe we have a species that has existed on Earth possibly for millions of years, that's in charge, that's in control, that is guiding humanity in a spiritual way, assisting us in ways that is on their agenda and to their possible benefit. And we continue to see how this phenomenon morphs over time that's consistent with society. I'm not sure what we're talking about in terms of what these UAPs are. Are they an existing species that's always been here and we're the new kids on the block? Or is it in fact intra or interdimensional in nature?
Or it could be, as we said earlier, all the above. Or it could just be we're in some sort of a simulation a la Tom Campbell.
Well, we interviewed Tom Campbell in our documentary on consciousness.media, where you can watch our film through Gaia. Tom Campbell is in our documentary, and he certainly is a strong advocate of, my big toe, the theory of everything based on the body being the avatar, and that we do indeed live in a simulated reality, and that consciousness is primary, and mass, matter, energy are all derivatives of consciousness. And he takes that approach that this is indeed a simulation. And if that's the case, then all bets are off. Anything is possible if that is indeed true.
Within certain parameters, right?
Yeah.
I think he would say that everything has like a probability distribution. In certain realities, things
True.
are programmed so that, you could have something that's highly unlikely. It would just, be on the a 6 Sigma or 8 Sigma event. Now,
right.
You mentioned NDEs, and I think you mentioned that you had one once. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I had not an NDE, but it was a shared death experience. One morning, it's about 12 years ago, one morning I had a lucid dream where I felt like I was suffocating and dying. I never had such a realistic dream like that. It was horrific, hyper real. And during that event, which obviously woke me up, I had the strong sense of knowingness that my dear friend and colleague who worked with me in my laboratory at college had died. Now, I didn't think much of that. I just thought that was, maybe a dream event. But I was thinking about that horrific, I'm going to die dream, lucid dream that I had as I was driving to work. When I put the key in the office door and I opened it up and looked at my colleagues' faces, it became quite apparent to me that my dear friend and colleague Anne had passed away that morning at the time that I had that lucid dream. And I asked her son at the funeral what time she passed away, and it was at the time that I had that lucid dream, early in the morning, about 6:30. And we always spoke about these kinds of things. I can see her imparting this information to me purposefully. She had a respiratory event that caused her death, which I experienced. It's like an empathic, shared death experience, and they're not all that unique. So it's not a near-death experience, but I sensed the passing of someone else. And based on that experience, I wrote the book, Life After Death, an analysis of the evidence. I had to learn more about the theories involved associated with the possibility that consciousness continues after bodily death. And I got more confirmation of that after my Kundalini Awakening, of that duality between consciousness and the body as two distinct, independent entities. Although during life, it's interdependent. We obviously are held hostage to our brain, but we need our brain. It reminds me of the neuroanatomist who had a stroke and lost function of her left hemisphere. I forget her name. It doesn't matter. She just had her right hemisphere functioning. And being a neuroanatomist, she was well aware of what was going on when she had her left hemisphere shut down. And she said, I wish everybody could experience just what the right hemisphere alone feels like, functioning with just the right hemisphere. It feels like you're moving from a solid to a fluid, at one with the universe. You feel compassion, love, empathy. You feel more humane. She says everybody should feel this because there would be peace on earth. There would be no war. It's our left hemisphere, the egoic. I want power, I want wealth, I want, etc., that often gives rise to the narcissistic psychopaths of our world that make life miserable for all of us in direct or indirect ways. That's the ills of society, ego. And I think that all of these paranormal events result in an ego dissolution, in a sense, where we become less egoic. And as a result, we're not the center of the universe anymore. We are revolving around what's most important, and we become more compassionate, more humane in the process. And when we have these various types of experiences, whether they be UAP or near-death experiences or Kundalini Awakenings, this is what happens to people. They regard them largely, again, more positive. They become more humane insofar as surveys are concerned, and convinced that we're all one. You hear these kind of spiritual messages, we're all one, love is the answer, and all of that. So it seems like there's an objective behind some of this phenomena that's helping us evolve spiritually, behaviorally, for those who experience it.
What do you think's happening now in terms of knowledge about the phenomena, disclosure? Do you think there's some sort of a quickening, or is this just more of the same?
Now, there's a quickening probably because of the internet. Podcasters like you reaching millions of people discussing these types of topics. So people are learning a great deal more about these kinds of phenomena than ever before. In a sense, that is certainly a quickening given the expressway of the internet. If you put a gun to my head, I'm not exactly still sure what I would say, other than these phenomena that we're talking about are valid. They are valid. We're just skimming the surface. We're still in the early stages of our embryonic development, evolutionary development, still scratching our heads, trying to figure out what it all means. And we have no clue, as far as I'm concerned, other than it is foreign to our terrestrial mode of thought. And the materialists, the skeptics, will never come on board unless it happens to them. And it is happening to many skeptics, politicians, and otherwise, who are now leading the charge, I think, on these congressional hearings. They're not immune to this phenomena. It affects millions of people. So why are politicians, military intelligence figures immune from it? They're not. And I think that eventually, there will be some form of disclosure, more revealing than we already have in our possession in terms of what the phenomena is about. But the problem is that I don't think they clearly understand truly what the phenomenon is. So they're limited in terms of their explanation because they can't answer the questions that the public will ask them about the phenomenon because they don't know, other than the fact that the phenomenon is real and it exists and there is an interaction with human beings. So they don't want to go there. They don't want to go there for the fear of religious considerations as well as a power struggle among countries.
Yeah, well, I think they're going to make themselves irrelevant in 15 to 20 years. I think that's where we're going, or at least where we're heading. because, I mean, my operating mode of thought regarding this is just there's no incentive for the government to reveal anything, so they're not. So the only way to understanding is for us to individually figure it out on our own. And if people choose to believe, that's, that's not my business, right? It's theirs. So I think the best thing you can do is seek knowledge as opposed to belief, right? You can only really account for what you personally experience as opposed to, because the other issue is that there's so much noise in the data as well, because, I'm sure the CIA, DIA, National Reconnaissance Office figured out that you could also cover conventional aerospace projects using the phenomenon as a cover, right? So there's a lot of noise in the data. So I think when you're talking to contactees, experiencers, try to adopt the mode that they're telling the truth, even though some of them may not be, right? Some of them may be plants, but I also wouldn't sell your house based on some of the information you're getting. I think it's going to be a personal journey for a lot of people, and all you can do is recount what happens to you and it just explain. Like the thing that just happened on this podcast, was that just a coincidence? Yeah, it could have been, right? But maybe. The last time that I had on my clock before that happened was 11:33. Does that mean anything? I don't know. Right? It's just multiples of 11. That's kind of weird. But and then this the phone shut off. I thought it just wasn't charging. It's perfectly charged. It just shut off. And then my main camera just shut off. What were we talking about? We were talking about sentient plasmoids. Should we read anything to that? I mean, a sane materialist would tell you it's just a coincidence, Sean, right? But that seems a little on the nose to me in the other direction.
Well, for all of those individual things to happen simultaneously during this time, it seems a little bit more than a meaningful coincidence. It can certainly be that way, but for it to be a true synchronicity, there has to be both timing and meaning. You have to explore yourself. What could the meaning be associated with the events that took place? The timing is there. The timing is there, but what's the meaning? There's a message that's being sent to you. And that's and I also said to you, you're going to experience things down the road because of your involvement as a noted podcaster in this arena. Just wait. You're asking for it, and I think the process may have started prematurely.
Oh no, I don't think it's premature. I want to see more of this stuff. Unfortunately, it's a careful what you wish for, right? But the other thing that I didn't tell you is while you were talking, I was looking for that photo that I wanted to show you afterwards of the owl, and I had just found it when everything went haywire. So again, maybe the process of digging through photos just caused all this stuff, right? Let's try to be fair, but it was.
The observation of owls is quite unique and often precedes a UAP interaction or a paranormal event. For some reason, owls are a unique animal in that regard. Why, I don't know, but it has often been associated as a precursor to things that are unexplainable. And maybe that's what's occurring with you.
So going forward, what advice would you give to people who are trying to explore this topic? Where should they start?
Well,
who should they read? In addition, aside from your book on consciousness, obviously, which is in the links below. But
well, thank you for mentioning that. And consciousness.media will take them to my documentary, The Consciousness Connection, which addresses, some of the information we're talking about. Because we did interview Gary Nolan, a noted geneticist, immunologist, who's the co-founder of the Soul Foundation and good friends with Jacques Vallée. Like all consumers, whether or not we're in Walmart or we're trying to find information about the proper sources of material, of products to read, to learn about this phenomenon, we have to be discriminating, because it's very easy to come to the wrong conclusion and making errors in inductive reasoning. We do it all the time. How many times do we make errors buying things that we shouldn't, or reading books, believing it when we shouldn't? I would advocate for people to read Jacques Vallée's books, Alan Hynek's books, John Mack's books. I would start there. I would certainly encourage them to read The Consciousness Connection. I make 10 cents on a dollar, so I'm not pushing it for money. I was in pain because of a bad back for 2 years, and during that time, I wrote this book, which was cathartic because it took my mind off the pain. But it addresses much of what we're talking about, because there are several chapters in there on the UAP, along with the information in our film, The Consciousness Connection, which I do believe people will enjoy. It's getting excellent reviews as we speak, which I'm very happy to hear. But we're going to be delving more into the UAP topic. But people have to understand that the phenomenon is indeed valid, but they have to, of course, as you said, where should people go to learn more about it? They have to be careful what podcasts they listen to. They should listen to you, certainly. And there are a few others on the UAP phenomenon, but they're few and far between in terms of good quality ones that have excellent guests. And I know you have many excellent guests on your show. I looked through the history of the guests that you've had, and you go for top flight people. I encourage you to do so, but you can't interpret everything literally, people. People will talk about this phenomenon, and you just can't take every word literally. You have to do your own research and come to your own conclusion. But I validate those of you who are watching your podcast and listening to you, because you are an expert in this area. You may not be an extensive experiencer in a sense, but you have thorough knowledge about many of these aspects of the phenomenon, which intrigues me greatly. I have some experience personally, and I've done some research on the Free Foundation, and I still have many questions. We're never going to have firm answers, and it can be very frustrating, especially when we hear disclosure initiatives and people's statements about how there's zero doubt that we have reverse engineered craft and biological material of extraterrestrial nature. Many people jump on that, interpret it literally, and come to the conclusion that that is true. It may be. It may not be. It's all anecdotal. But I will go so far as to say that the phenomenon certainly is valid, whether or not it's extraterrestrial, cryptoterrestrial, and that's anybody's guess. That's anybody's guess. But it's fun to read about it, process it, but it's also frustrating because we get nothing but anecdotal information. When I, in particular, as a scientist, you are very knowledgeable. You want hard evidence. It just doesn't exist, or at least it's not made apparent to the public at this point in time yet.
Although you can do personal experiments, the problem is they're not going to be under rigorous lab conditions or standards, but you kind of just have to start with convincing yourself that there's a there. And then from there, you figure out what works and what doesn't, and then you continue to explore what that may be. The other thing that I found that's helpful in this podcast, every guest that I have on, I'm not going to personally say that I personally endorse this story, I believe it, etc. The whole purpose behind this podcast is to uncover truth. So have I had people on who are just weaving yarns? Maybe. There's no way for me to truly know. But I try to get as many ideas on here on this podcast as possible, because eventually, through mosaic theory, right, you can figure out there are going to be certain commonalities that come up over and over and over again. And from that, you can kind of figure out a little bit about the phenomenon. That said, there's also going to be some survivorship bias, right? So
That's right.
the people with experiences that they don't want to talk about, or there may be people out there who just never came back, right? So we're never, again, I'm not trying to go dark. I'm just trying to be as objective and fair as I possibly can. We don't talk to those people because they're not around or they don't want to speak. We also don't talk to people who are buried deep in some of these military programs, because if they do speak up, they'll either be sent to prison at the very least or terminated at, in the worst kind of case scenario. Another thing to put out when you're talking about former military or current military intelligence officials, they will lie, but they don't always lie to fool you, so to speak. Sometimes there are other motivations, like strategic deception campaigns against peer competitors, right? So let's say, I'm just making this up, let's say that, oh no, I'll actually use a real example, right? I don't know if it's real or not, but you've seen these isotopic ratios, right? Let's assume, and I don't believe this, but I'm just creating a scenario. Let's assume that that's a red herring. Let's say we want the Russians and the Chinese to just spin billions of dollars of research into trying to manipulate isotopic ratios in order to get emergent properties in faster than light travel or anti-gravity research. And then they see this, they decide to investigate it, and they're wasting a ton of resources when we know that it's something else, right? So there's sometimes I wouldn't call it noble, but a pro-US attempt to, protect the United States and to protect its technological progress and advancements from being replicated or followed. So there might be a reason for that as well. So just when you're using discernment, always think, what's the motivation of this individual? Why are they coming forward? And I do the same thing for the thing that intrigued me about Bledsoe is not because he had a book called UFO of God, right? In fact, that kind of made me a little bit more suspicious. But the reason I wanted to talk to him is all these intelligence officials showed up at his house and tried to shut him up and kept his mouth shut for at least a decade. Why? There's something, there's a there, right?
That's right. That's right.
So,
yeah. And I appreciate what you're saying. In fact, the incidence of out-of-body experiences and near-death experiences are much, much higher percentage-wise in those who have UAP interactions than those who do not. It's as if they're an encounter-prone personality. And Chris Bledsoe apparently had a near-death experience. How that might relate to his interaction with the orb phenomena in his backyard, that remains to be seen. I have a story about Chris Bledsoe, but I'm not going to air it publicly. But yes.
There's actually a precognitive dreamer in the UK. His name's Christopher Robinson. He participated in the University of Arizona study with Dr. Gary Schwartz.
Mm-hmm.
He saw the Lockerbie bombing, wrote it down in an affidavit, marched into MI5 in Scotland Yard and said, I want to put this on the record. And they're like, are you sure you want to do that? You get in trouble. Think you're a plotter. So he's like, no, I'm tired of seeing these things before they happen. I want this on the record. And then, of course, the Lockerbie bombing happened right after that precognitive dream. Wow. He also saw 9/11. He let the NSA know about it. Several years before. He didn't know if it was going to be in London or New York. And I've spoken to him. I've also spoken to the guy that he told, who was Thomas Drake, who was also a whistleblower and had the kind of FBI throw the book at him, but beat the charges, et cetera, et cetera. So the reason I'm bringing up Christopher Robinson is when he was also about the same age that Chris Bledsoe was, he had a near-death experience because he had to have like a heart valve replaced or something like that. He was like kind of the first child to have some specific form of open heart surgery. So there's definitely some connection when people have near-death experiences, as you probably well know. It tends to kind of open a gateway of some sort where they're more attuned to a lot of these sorts of things.
That's very true. There's no question about it. Again, Kenneth Ring, noted psychologist, came up with that term, encounter-prone personality. People who have near-death experiences, people who have even UAP experiences, report to become more psychic, not only more humane and sensitive to the planet and other people, but they can tend to be healers. They feel like they have healing capabilities, like Reiki, so to speak. But they say they develop ESP, psychic powers. They don't know why, but it may just come as a byproduct, a symptom of these expanded consciousness that seems to be symptomatic of near-death experiences where people go down that rabbit hole and start questioning reality after they have an experience that is beyond belief, where they feel compassion and love. I once spoke to a woman who had a near-death experience, and she said, the love I felt during my near-death experience was like looking in the eyes of your newborn child for the first time, magnified 10 million times.
Mm-hmm.
Now that's love. Now that's love. When people feel that, when they have those kinds of experiences, awe-inspiring for whatever reason, near-death, UAP, or otherwise, it changes people. It changes their attitude, how they perceive themselves and others. But it often has to be such an unconventional event, such as that, such as what we're talking about. But it's not limited to just what we're talking about. It could be ESP and Kundalini, among many other things in life. There are over 200 different extraordinary human experiences that people can have. But in the process, it makes people truth seekers. They obviously have millions of questions that if I had a near-death experience, I'm going to say, well, look, it moved me because I almost died. That alone is an issue to wrestle with. But I also have come to the realization that there's more to reality than I ever thought possible because of my experience and everything else that came with it. All the symptoms associated with it that changes people dramatically, profoundly, which results in career changes, even changes in spouses who see more eye to eye with them. For those who have near-death experiences, 70% of them wind up having a divorce within 7 years. That's how much they are changed personally by that experience. Now, divorce is high percentage-wise, but that is still considerably above the average divorce rate. So these events do change people dramatically, generally for the better, but it's not always very positive because people ask these obvious questions. Why me? What happened? What do I do about it? Who do I talk to about it? There are burning issues and questions that people have to deal with, and they're reluctant oftentimes to discuss it with others for fear of ridicule, obviously, and the associated stigma, so they hold it inside, which doesn't do them any good, although we read material on it. And again, they have to be discriminating consumers about who and what to read. And if you want to read about near-death experiences, I would recommend Jeff Long and Bruce Grayson and Eben Alexander, who you plan on having on your show. He is in our documentary, The Consciousness Connection. And again, consciousness.media is where you can go, if I may say, for the second
the link below.
Thank you.
Also, your books, all three of them, right?
4, actually, with the last one, The Consciousness Connection.
Yeah, I didn't ask you about the unseen, like that. I should a little bit more about that. That's interesting.
Unseen forces.
Yeah.
That's what led to the documentary. A producer read it and he called me up. Let's go out to lunch. And he says, I'd love to turn this into a film. And that book, Unseen Forces, The Integration of Science, Reality, and You, was written right after my Kundalini Awakening. I had to do more research as attempting to be a discriminating consumer because I had more questions than answers, having a spiritual emergency after having that Kundalini Awakening. You talk about asking questions. Why me? What happened? What do I do about it? How do I integrate it? Who do I talk to about it? I mean, you're stuck. In a sense, you're bewildered by these experiences for a good period of time. In the long term, it's generally very positive, but in the short term, it can certainly be traumatic. I don't mean to say that all these kinds of experiences are highly positive. In the long term, they certainly can be, but they can be hellish as well.
Any final words for the audience?
Continue to watch your podcast. I consider you a very intelligent interviewer, so I appreciate being on stage in a sense with you. But people have to be objective about everything in life, which is almost impossible given our biases that we all have. So I would just, focus on the people I mentioned and talked about. And if you're going to read material on that, I would seek those sources as probably the best lines of evidence.
Well, thank you, Bob. Dr. Davis, I appreciate you. And I thought this was extremely interesting. And I hope the audience learns a lot from it. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean. It's been an absolute pleasure to be with you.
If you enjoyed today's video, please hit like and subscribe, and also hit the notification button so you can be notified whenever I post new content. Thank you. Now, if you're enjoying the channel and you want to support it, there are several things you can do. In fact, there are 5 things you can do. The first thing you can do is just buy my books. I got plenty of books out in the market right now, and I would prefer that folks buy a book rather than giving me direct support because they get something out of it. They get a real tangible product. The second way you can support me is by becoming a member on YouTube or becoming a patron on Patreon. And just go to either site and it'll explain everything. The third way you can support the channel is by checking out my merch site, which is here. There's plenty of stuff that you could get to support the channel. And I'd appreciate that you have it and can wear it. Not only do you help support the channel, but you also help promote the channel, and I appreciate that. The fourth way that you can support the channel, and this is really easy, is anytime you want to buy something on Amazon, literally just go to the description below and click on any link, literally any link. The channel gets a cut of that, and it costs you no extra money. You just go through the link, as I'm part of the Amazon Affiliates Club. The fifth and final way you can support the channel is through donations. Now, I don't prefer these because it's more of an expression of gratitude, but you don't really get anything out of it as a subscriber to the channel. However, if you decide to do these options, there's 2 options. There's Buy Me a Coffee, which is a separate site, and there's also, you can go through YouTube with either a super chat, super sticker, or a super thanks. Again, I prefer Buy Me a Coffee because that organization takes less money than Amazon does. But either way, I appreciate any support you are willing to give the channel. So thank you very much and keep watching. I really appreciate it.